Good morning. A quorum being present, this oversight hearing on the Committee of Education and Labor, the GAO Undercover investigation, wage theft in America's vulnerable workers, will now come to order. And pursuant to Rule 7C, any member may submit an opening statement in writing, which will be made part of the permanent record. And the Chair now recognizes itself for the purposes of making an opening statement, and then I will recognize Mr. McKean, the senior Republican on the committee. The Committee on Education and Labor meets this morning to examine the results of the Government Accountability Office undercover investigation last year into practices of the Wage and Hour Division of the Department of Labor. In our first hearing on wage theft in July, we learned that millions of workers were robbed of their hard-earned wages every day. GAO testified that the very agency tasked to fight wage theft had failed to effectively investigate and properly track the number of cases involved in our nation's minimum wage, overtime, and child labor laws. In fact, GAO cited 15 case studies that showed the failure of the agencies to fully investigate and properly address violations of the law. Hundreds of cases were found where the agency did not assign an investigator for more than a year after the initial complaint. Delays effectively deny justice because of the 2-year statute of limitation on wage theft. As a result of their initial investigation, the GAO concluded that thousands of complaints handled by the Wage and Hour Division were likely mishandled over the past decade. These failures likely resulted in workers receiving little or no restitution at all from their employers. In light of these initial findings, the committee asked GAO to continue its investigation and dig deeper to see whether highlighted cases were isolated or a symptom of larger problems throughout the agency. This morning, the GAO reports back to the committee on what they learned during their undercover investigation. From today's testimony, it is clear that there are serious problems with the Wage and Hour Division's ability to effectively enforce the law. The agency has dropped the ball in far too many cases in pursuing employers that cheat their workers out of their hard-earned wages. Some Wage and Hour employees explicitly discourage GAO undercover investigators posing as workers from filing the complaints. Other complaints went unanswered. Anonymous tips of children illegally operating dangerous machinery did not get investigated at all. Not only was this allegation never investigated, but the complaint did not appear in the agency's computers that are used to track cases. Dropping the ball on child labor complaints could be potentially deadly. I wish this was not an isolated incident. The GAO found time and again complaints were routinely brushed aside, improperly tracked, or inadequately investigated. I'm concerned about the pattern of inaction and properly addressing thousands of cases involving overtime, minimum wage, child labor violations. Because these violations of law are not trivial, those most vulnerable to wage theft are likely bearing the brunt of our nation's economic crises. Families where a breadwinner has his or her wages stolen still have rent to pay, mouths to feed, children to clothe, and medicine to buy. They can't afford to be paid less than what the law says. Simply put, when a business pockets wages due to its workers, it's theft and it's illegal. Today's testimony will help inform Congress and the new leadership in the Department of Labor on whether additional resources, better training, or improved statutory language are needed. We owe it to all hardworking Americans to ensure that the federal government lives up to its responsibility to guarantee that families are not being cheated out of their wages by unscrupulous employers. Ultimately, I believe that improving the Wage and Hour Division will come down to strong leadership and a renewed commitment to enforce the law. I believe that was lacking in the past administration. I believe that the previous Secretary of Labor was essentially absent without leave with regard to the enforcement of the laws on behalf of the safety of workers and the wages of workers. I am confident that the Obama administration and Secretary Solis are committed to turning this egregious record around and ensuring that all workers are treated fairly by their employers and their government. And I'd like now to yield to Mr. McKean for his opening statement.
Thank you, Chairman Miller, and good morning. Today's hearing is about work and pay. It's the energy that drives the American dream. Republicans have long believed in the value and dignity of work and the rewards that come from it. Take welfare reform. Back in the 90s, Republicans pushed to change a system that for decades gave money to people for not working. Today, welfare recipients earn their benefits by working or training for a new job, or taking classes to get the skills they need to join the workforce later. They are no longer dependent on the government. Instead, government becomes dependent on them, as recipients eventually earn a living on their own and pay taxes. And many years later, I'm happy to report that bipartisan welfare reform is still working. From 1996 to 2006, the Heritage Foundation says the number of people receiving welfare dropped by nearly 60%. For these and all American workers, we have a duty to ensure that federal workplace laws are enforced. And that brings us to the subject of today's hearing, wage theft. Mr. Chairman, I'm not sure this is the best language to discuss the whole range of issues that need our attention in this area. The allegations we're examining are not always theft as we know it. The U.S. Department of Labor's Wage and Hour Division is responsible for enforcing a whole host of workplace laws. For instance, we'll hear today about alleged violations of child labor laws. This isn't a question of so-called wage theft, but it's an equally important concern. Rather than using politically charged language, I think we should ease the rhetoric and focus on the serious issues at hand. And with the seriousness of these issues, I can't help but notice that no one from the Labor Department is testifying today. That's too bad. Mr. Chairman, I respectfully submit that in addition to the expert testimony we will hear from the GAO, it would have been helpful to have someone from the department here with us today. A Labor Department expert could have brought a different perspective to the problems of so-called wage theft. We've been told that a lack of political appointees within the administration precludes the Department of Labor from testifying today. I certainly appreciate the fact that the department, indeed the entire administration, is still in transition. However, that does not explain why career civil servants at the department, many of whom have spent decades enforcing these laws, could not have testified today and offered their thoughts. At a minimum, one of these longtime officials with responsibility for enforcement of our wage and hour laws might have offered an explanation for dereliction of duty alleged by the GAO. More importantly, that expert could have offered possible solutions to the problem. At our urging, I understand that the majority requested that a Department of Labor official testify here today. I'm told the department declined. I'm not sure how persistent we were in pressing the department on this point, Mr. Chairman, but personally, I don't think we should have taken no for an answer. If we're serious about enforcing the law and not just scoring political points, we should insist on bringing the individuals who are responsible for investigating wage and hour violations here to account for their actions. That said, the GAO has done extensive work in this area. I'm sure there are things we can learn from this investigation, and I welcome Mr. Cutts to the GAO back to the committee once again. Thank you, Chairman Miller. I yield back.
Thank you. The chair would just respond that as it has been since I've become chair of the committee, the GAO will testify on its findings, and we will ask the Department of Labor, and we will be asking the Department of Labor, the new Department of Labor, what they will be doing and their recommendations to follow up on this, because I think at the end of the day we're going to see that the laws are inadequate and fail to protect the very people whose wages are being stolen. I do not think that wage theft is a too severe a term. A conscious decision, as you'll see in the record, has been made to deny these people the wages that they're entitled to under the law. That's, you're stealing, may only be $1 an hour, a few dollars an hour, but what you will see is it adds up to very serious money for thousands and millions of workers in this country who do not get the benefit of the wages that they signed up to earn for the work that they in fact do. There's not a lot of allegations these people didn't do the job. They did the job. They weren't paid at the conclusion of the job on either the legal rate or the agreed rate by their employer. And so we have a long ways to go here yet.
Mr. Chairman, may I respond?
Sure.
I agree with you totally. That's why I say that we should have someone here from the Department of Labor.
With all due respect,
they should be held account for that.
With all due respect, we had people here from the Department of Labor before, and it was fairly pathetic in terms of their inability to provide the data. So we'll give the new department a chance to get up and running. We expect them to come and to respond to this and to help us develop a solution to it.
Again, Mr. Chairman, and this will be my final comment on this, there will be a few people at the top of the department replaced, but there are many people there that have been there for a number of years that have the responsibility for enforcing these laws, I'd like to know why they haven't been. If
And-
it's because
and
of
I
their
think
top
it's-
leadership, then that should
I
be
think
brought
as
out.
we,
in
I
there.
think as we'll see, they utterly failed in that obligation.
Mr. Chairman, if I may ask a question of the chair?
Yes.
And I apologize for being a bit late, but are we going to, is this committee going to have the Department of Labor come in and respond to this report at any point? Is that,
That's my intention. When we start to consider legislation, we will want their response as to what happened here and what we need to do and what we should go do going forward.
in a hearing format?
I would expect so, yeah.
Thank you.
Mr. Kurtz, welcome to the committee. Let me just introduce Mr. Kurtz to the committee once again. He needs no introduction for the members, but certainly for the audience. Gregory Kurtz is currently the Managing Director of GAO's Forensic Audits and Special Investigations Unit. Mr. Kurtz has testified and been responsible for investigative reports about the federal government's handling of Hurricanes Katrina and Rita, security at airports and borders, and security at radioactive materials, among other important issues. Mr. Kurtz has testified before the committee several times, including last Congress when he testified about the abuses in teen residential treatment industry. Mr. Kurtz is accompanied by Jonathan Meyer, who is the Assistant Director of GAO's Forensic Audits and Special Investigations Unit. Mr. Kurtz, welcome to the committee, and we look forward to your testimony. You know the rules. We'll give you 5 minutes here to try to summarize your report and then open it up for questions. 10 minutes, excuse me. 10 minutes for you to summarize your report and then open it up for questions. Thank you.
Mr. Chairman and members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to discuss the Department of Labor's investigations of wage and hour complaints. Last July, I testified before this committee that 15 cases of wage theft were not adequately investigated. Today's testimony highlights the results of our investigation into whether those 15 cases were isolated or the tip of the iceberg. My testimony has two parts. First, I will discuss the results of our investigation, and second, I will discuss our recommendations and conclusions. First, our covert testing clearly shows that the complaint intake process is fundamentally flawed. Posing as fictitious wage theft victims, we filed 10 common complaints with labor offices across the country. We also posed as a fictitious employer that had committed the labor law violations. Examples of our findings include no response to a message we left that children were working during school hours and operating circular saws and meat grinders. One fictitious employee being told not to file a complaint unless he had another job lined up. Investigators accepting employer refusals to pay without question. And cases recorded in the system as paid even after our bogus employee told the department that they were not. We also found that most calls we made during business hours went directly into voicemail and oftentimes were never returned. At the end of my presentation, I will play several clips from the undercover calls we made to labor offices across the country. We also investigated cases involving over 1,000 actual wage theft victims. These cases were identified through data mining, and thus they cannot be projected to all investigations. However, they clearly show that many investigations are not adequate. For example, one employer agreed that it owed 93 employees $200,000. However, this employer stalled until the 2-year statute of limitations had expired. This case was closed with no collections. In another case, an investigator found that 438 employees were owed $230,000. This case was not assigned for 22 months, and once again ultimately was closed with no collections. One allegation was from an employee that worked at a sheriff's office. The investigator closed this case after 2 phone calls were not returned. We also found that conciliation cases are oftentimes not recorded in the Department of Labor's systems. Conciliations generally reflect complaints of one or several employees. We found that the head of the Southeast region, which has about 57% of these types of complaints, instructed offices in that region not to record failed attempts at conciliation. Thus, it is not surprising that our statistical sample showed that 95% of recorded conciliations were adequately investigated. This is a good news, bad news story. The good news is that when adequate investigations are performed, there are often positive results. The bad news is that likely thousands of these failed conciliation cases are never recorded in the system. Non-conciliation cases generally involve a larger number of employees. Our statistical sampling of these cases showed that 81% of the time they were adequately investigated. For example, in one case, it was completed in 4 months with $59,000 collected for 12 convenience store employees. This case involved detailed payroll analysis and complete follow-up to ensure that all of the employees were in fact paid. The flip side to this is that 19% of the larger cases are not adequately investigated. This leaves thousands of victims vulnerable to wage theft with no help from the federal government. Moving on to my second point, based on our overall work, we have concluded that the complaint intake and investigation processes are not effective. We plan to issue a report with several recommendations to labor to improve their human capital, processes, and the use of technology. For example, we were surprised to find that investigators had no special technology or tools to do their work. If labor's mission in this area is to properly investigate wage theft allegations, then they need specialized tools to research and identify individuals and businesses. My unit would be far less effective in serving the Congress without the critical research tools that we use every day. In addition, throughout our work, we found many symptoms of human capital problems. We will be recommending for labor to take a look at matters such as hiring, training, and whether sufficient staff are on board to achieve the mission. In conclusion, our work shows that the 15 cases I described for you last year were in fact the tip of the iceberg. I am concerned that thousands of victims of wage theft become frustrated with the complaint intake process and never actually file complaints with labor. Thousands of others who file complaints find themselves victims of unscrupulous employers who know how to beat the system. I'm also concerned that with the current economic crisis that wage theft is increasing. Congress and the new administration have an opportunity to make changes that would better protect our nation's most vulnerable workers. Mr. Chairman, as I mentioned, I would like to now play some clips from the undercover calls we made that will give you and the members of this committee an inside look at what real victims of wage theft can face when dealing with the federal government.
Okay, well, you will have to pay him what at least the minimum wage for all the hours that he works.
Well, like I said, all of our contracts have dried up. We really don't have anything coming in, so.
Okay.
Yeah,
so you're just not in a position where you can pay him?
No.
Okay, well then I will let him know that he has his private right to action to pursue the funds.
Once the employer tells me that they're not going to pay and that they can't, my ability to, force payment has ended.
So you really have no power to do anything? I mean, all you did was just call and ask her to pay me. I mean, and she just...
And, well, the thing is that I explained the law to her. She knows that she needs to pay you. It's just that she's saying she doesn't have the money to. I can't bring blood from a stone. I am bound by the laws that I'm able to enforce, the money that Congress gives us, and all of that lovely stuff. If you are having a problem with what our office is capable of achieving based on the laws that were written, then you need to write your congressmen. Okay, do you know who your congressmen are? I mean, we can use all the help we can get.
You sure you don't want to just have a nice conversation with him yourself?
No, I don't want to, because he gets very loud and angry.
Okay, well, here's another avenue that you can pursue. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Do you have another job lined up?
No.
Okay, you might want to do that before you file a complaint with us. Because I can't guarantee that he's not going to fire you.
Yeah, they have to have a certain ADV amount for us to have enterprise coverage, and they don't have it.
What's that mean? I don't understand.
What the gross sales is for the year.
How do you get that?
We report off of the IRS statements.
Oh, so you check with IRS, and IRS says that he reports less than that.
Yeah.
We have a backlog right now of about like 8 months.
Oh,
8 to
okay.
10 months.
Okay.
So we're not even going to be starting investigation in 8 to 10 months.
Please leave a message, and the officer of the day will return your call as soon as possible.
I've seen a place, I think it's called CP&D Meat Packaging or something like that in Modesto, California. I've seen kids working there. I believe they're underage. They work. They seem to be working all day, probably during school and working on some heavy type of equipment like I guess you call them circular saws, and the ones that the machine that makes like hamburger meat.
Mr. Chairman, that ends our statement. Mr. Meyer and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much. When you look at the 10 cases and then the other cases, I mean, you really see an array of just failures, and in some cases construction of misinformation and misleading and wrong information to the individuals. I mean, you have these incredible delays, which are obviously, the delay appears to turn out to be costly to the employee because the statute of limitations has already started running. So if the department uses up 5, 6, 7, 8 months before they even investigate, or they just drag the investigation along, the employee all of a sudden loses their right to go to court. Is that correct?
That's correct, yes.
So you have other situations where they don't record the complaints at all, so the department's never on the hook for whether they have successfully completed the investigation and gotten money for the person or resolved the case. That's not part of the database.
Yeah, 5 of the 10 cases that we did the undercover calls were not recorded in the Labor Department's system.
And you also have, we heard on the tapes here, where you have employees basically just saying, we asked the employer to pay you, they said they're not going to pay, we're done.
Correct. That's something we've seen frequently, not just this time, but the 15 cases from last year also.
You know, it's really quite stunning. But then on top of that, I think it was the last tape that we heard. You heard an employer, the employee of the Wage and Hour Division, basically make up a scenario that never occurred about going to the IRS and not having the wage pay. So you have an employee openly lying, constructing a lie to the person whose wages have been illegally taken, been stolen from them. This government employee is lying to them about why they will not pursue the investigation because they went to a non-existent database on a non-existent case and came back and said, we can't help you. Is that correct?
That's correct, and we've referred that individual to the Inspector General of the Department of Labor for potential administrative.
So there is some level of malfeasance here when you start lying to the public about the law that some action can be taken. You referred that to where?
The Department of Labor Inspector General.
Inspector General of the Department of Labor.
Correct. And the Department of Labor was concerned. We've talked to the Department of Labor, people in charge of this division. They're very concerned about employees lying to citizens who call into the hotline. I would hope that they would be. I mean, we've got to at least start with some base of obligation here in terms of doing the job on behalf of the public. Well, I'm encouraged that you've made that referral. Hopefully, that will help other employees think about what their obligation is. But even the act of simply saying, we asked the employer told us no, and that's the end of the case. The employees could do that themselves, and they probably already have been told no by the employers.
So, I mean, what they're looking for is additional resources and help when they come to the government, are they not?
Yeah, but when I was talking about symptoms of human capital problems, the discouraging of people from filing complaints would seem to be a symptom that there's either not enough people to answer the phones, not enough people to follow up investigations, or something along those lines. And certainly they're making decisions that the small conciliation cases I mentioned, which are one or several employees, are low priority, and that makes sense compared to the bigger cases. But they have to be honest with people and say, we just don't have time to get to you. And again, you did see the one case there where they said, we've got an 8 to 10 month backlog. We won't get to your case for 8 to 10 months. And as you said, the clock ticks on those cases, so that doesn't necessarily help the employee.
You know, you have I guess there's a problem here. You know, in one of the cases, not in your undercover case, but in the other one, I think it's number 2, you know, it's $800 in back wages. That's a small case, perhaps, to the Department of Labor to a worker and to his family that week or that 2-week pay period, whatever it is. That's a significant chunk of money, and that's important to them. And to just be told that the answer is no, that's a loss of $800 to that individual. I mean, that's...
Yes, I mean, that's true.
I don't know what the threshold is. Did you find any formal threshold at which point you did not proceed? The Department of Wage and Hours did not proceed to recover wages?
We've asked that question at 2 levels. Number one, from an investigation standpoint, is there a threshold where you will actually do an investigation? And it's unclear what that is. And number 2 is when you have a legitimate case, we've seen cases with tens or hundreds of thousands of dollars. Sometimes they're litigated by the solicitor's office, sometimes they're not. I mean, certainly their criteria is large, we believe, but why some large or semi-large and others semi-large aren't, why some are and some aren't, we're not completely clear, and it's not documented exactly what that criteria would be. So it's 2 levels. I mean, sometimes they're not actually supporting the investigators by taking it over the goal line and going to court with the unscrupulous employers in those cases.
You know, you have cases, you have $66,000 for 21 employees where basically, I think it's case number 9, the ambulance company, the Wage and Hour Division essentially walked away from that case. They just said, well, it's taken too long. You have $47,000 in overtime to 98 employees. Again, they cited some evidence as a reason for not having the employer pay. The evidence turned out to be essentially fictitious. It did not exist. $150,000 due 191 employees. The employer said that he would have to file bankruptcy. They took that as acceptable. Did nothing more on behalf of that person. And well, I guess they negotiated down, but the person never filed bankruptcy.
Right. They compromised on that.
They compromised on that.
Correct.
You have 241 employees that were owed nearly $2 million in overtime, and Wage and Hours rejected the employer's offer to pay $50,000 in back wages, and then eventually sent letters saying this employer is not going to pay, you're on your own.
Correct. Yes.
So again, we don't know that here you have $2 million and you have an $800 theft of a paycheck. There's apparently no threshold within the department.
No, only they define the conciliations are small and non-conciliations are large, but even within those, they are pursued with different levels of enforcement and aggressiveness with respect to calls, site visits, or whatever other types of things. And as you mentioned, the bankruptcy thing is interesting. There's several cases where they closed the case because they said the company was bankrupt. We checked our databases. They're not bankrupt. I mean, and it gets into those tools I mentioned. Do you have the right tools to do investigations? There are tools out there where you can check things like bankruptcy fairly readily.
But they just don't go through that forensic process?
I don't believe they have the tools in that particular case to use. That's what I understand. Is that correct?
That's correct. They don't have access to public court records. That's just not part of their processes.
Did you see any change from when you testified in Congress to the end of the year? I mean, when you were doing this investigation, did you see any change from your initial determinations? Was there any response to the initial GAO report?
I can speak to that. Initially, from our testimony last year, there was some level of disbelief, but in our closing conferences on this report and especially the statistical sample testing, the Wage and Hour officials in Washington have seen the problems that are there and really seem concerned about what we found and are looking to find ways to improve.
Well, Mr. Chairman, I would say, too, that we now know that there are many cases that are properly investigated and collected. And so the real issue is, why are 81% of the big cases done effectively and 19% not? The good news is 81% there's an effective investigation, but 19% represents tens or hundreds of thousands of people over time. That's pretty significant. And so why there's those differences like that, that to me is too high of a rate of unsuccessful investigations.
Just one last question, and I'll turn to my colleagues. Is there a regional difference? Is there a regional explanation? Is it?
I would say that in certain regions of the country, whether there's a strong state labor enforcement, state officials that enforce labor laws, makes a difference in how effective the wage and hour division is because of the assistance they receive from the state.
So if the state's running a strong operation, it's more likely you'll have stronger enforcement at the federal level?
I think it allows the resources at the wage and hour division to handle some of the bigger cases, some of the more problematic instances, instead of a lot of these smaller individual cases for one person.
I see. Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Coots.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm still in a little bit of a quandary of what we're doing here. We can beat up on the Department of Labor, but we don't have them to really hear. I mean, there's what you're talking about, the 19%. It sounds to me that's pretty indefensible, but I would like to see somebody here and what they have to say about it. When I was in school, 80% was a B. The 19% probably should get an F, but why this is happening, I would really like to know. Can you tell me, Mr. Coots, how many people work at the Department of Labor?
No, I don't know. We know within wage and hour there are over 700 investigators and a little over 1,000 staff. We focused on the wage and hour division. I'm not familiar with the whole department.
700 investigators and 1,000 staff. So 1,700 people work in the wage and hour?
No, that's total. The total is 1,000. There's several hundred technicians and other administrators. There's 700 some investigators.
1,000 people?
Roughly.
To investigate how many complaints would you estimate in a year?
Well, in the system, in 2007, there were a little over 30,000 recorded. But as I mentioned, a lot of cases never get recorded in the system. So it's probably 30 plus several thousand more at least. So let's say
at least 30.
At least 30, yes.
And we've got 1,000 people to investigate 30,000, and they're doing a good job on 81% of them and a lousy job on 19% of them.
Of the bigger cases,
you know, maybe we're just holding this hearing to beat up on the Bush administration. I don't know, but out of
one of the 20%, I think you'd want to know what happened to my wages.
No question. That's why I'd like to see somebody from the Department of Labor that we could zero in on. I didn't disturb you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate it. Thank you. Mr. Coots, you've testified as to the failures of frontline rank-and-file federal employees at the Department of Labor in handling and processing wage and hour complaints. There's nothing in your testimony to suggest that these shortcomings were the result of any directive by any political appointee of the prior administration. Is there?
Nothing that we saw of that, no.
You're not suggesting that these career federal employees were told by Washington to mishandle or delay processing complaints, are you?
We have no evidence of that, no.
Again, that's why I wonder why we're going through this. You've testified at length about your findings at this most recent analysis of case handling. By way of comparison, do you have any similar analysis of enforcement under prior administrations?
I believe the other GAO report went back into the 1990s and showed declining numbers of investigators of about 20%, but I don't know if we've got any program reviews in the 1990s that I'm aware of. Do we?
Possibly if we increase the number of investigators. You say this started decreasing back in 1990?
From 1997 to 2007, it reduced by about 25% the number of investigators in this division. So over a 10-year period, it went down by 20 to 25%.
That may be one of the solutions that we could attack to help the other 20% or 19%. Has your study revealed any evidence to suggest that frontline rank-and-file government workers were handling cases differently during the Clinton administration?
We don't know that. Can't comment on that.
Or the Bush administration before that, or the Reagan administration before that?
No, we just know for the last 2 or 3 years, that's the time frame we've looked at.
Okay, so Mr. Chairman, I think that this is really important issue. If we have 19% of people who have serious complaints, it sounds to me like we do, we ought to really bring the Department of Labor in here, ask them why this is happening, ask them if they think that by adding additional people into the wage and hour investigation process would help solve this, then we should do something about changing the budgetary requests or the budgetary requirements or something within the department. You know, I don't think we disagree that people should be paid for their work. You know, I think we're all in agreement on that. If this is just a political witch hunt to try to blame the Bush administration, that's one thing. If it's to really solve the problem, then we should have people hear from the department. We should get to the bottom of it. I personally think, aside from hearing, you know, I mean, this is pretty bad stuff, what you've shown here, that if we have people at the department, career people, that are giving these kind of responses to people that are making serious requests, that should be handled. And it sounds like you're not blaming it on the administration giving false direction or telling them to do certain things a certain way. Of the 15 people that you called, were you able to nail down to like a couple of employees that were making the same mistakes over and over, or giving these kind of?
In the Baltimore office, there was one individual that answered the phone several times. There's usually 1 or 2 people answering the phone, and so we did 6 different offices. I'll tell you, the offices we did were Baltimore, Birmingham, Dallas, Miami, San Jose, and West Covina, California. Those were the 6 offices we called. So you typically would get the same person if you made multiple calls to an office. But Baltimore, several of the ones you heard on the audio earlier were the same person in Baltimore, some of the more egregious cases.
Then I think we could seriously nail down some of this stuff and fix it, and that's what we should be doing.
And we agreed to. The Department of Labor asked us for the information so they know who those employees are, and they can do training, counseling, administrative actions, whatever the case may be. So we'll share with them.
And maybe they have made progress in that we don't know about, and that's why, again, we should have somebody here from the department to find out. I think we understand that most of these are career appointees. I mean, not appointees. They're career people that have applied for jobs, that have taken jobs, that are doing the jobs, and maybe out of the 1,000 people, maybe 990 are doing a good job, or maybe 900 are doing a good job, or maybe 10 are doing a terrible job, or 100 are doing a terrible job. But at some point, we should get serious about really fixing the problem instead of trying to point political blame. That's my point in this whole thing, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. The Chair will recognize himself. You want to keep talking about political blame. Let's just understand something. I became chairman of this committee 2 years ago. I don't remember any oversight on this problem prior to my becoming chair. We asked a question of GAO because this issue has been raised. It was raised many, many years throughout the construction trades, throughout all kinds of occupations. We could get no responses. We asked GAO. They investigated at the time of period. They couldn't go back and investigate with you know, we weren't there, they weren't there. And this is what we found. When we saw the first report, we said, you know, this is a serious problem. Would you go in depth and find out, was your first report, you know, an anomaly, or is there something systematically wrong with this? Is this a systemic problem? They've come back now with this report and says it's much more widespread, and it is about 19%, 20% of the cases. It's serious. It's costing people a lot of money. They're not following through. We will then take the next step. So, you know, it falls on whatever watch you want. This isn't about the politics of that. I became chairman, and I asked this question because I've you know, the issues of people being paid off the books, people being denied overtime, this is not new. It may be new to you and to this Congress because there was no concern expressed about this over the last many years. And so here it is, and we will have the Department of Labor in. We expect them to partner with us to work out the solutions to this problem and get these people the wages that they're due. Many of these people will never see their wages because there was a lack of oversight. There wasn't due diligence on this issue. We would hope the people now and the department, recognizing the problem they have there, will change. And I think it will under the new secretary and new people. Why would you carry on in this inherited problem? But the purpose of here is to get the change on behalf of working people that every day are losing wages that are entitled to them. So we will go through this process, and everybody will be included, and everybody will have a chance to participate.
Mr. Chairman, may I respond?
Sure.
You became chairman a little over 2 years ago. I was chairman a little less than a year. At the time, we were very, very busy, as you remember, finishing up conference on the pension bill, passing the mining safety
No,
law.
I'm not saying you weren't doing your job. I'm just saying, but
I
you know,
understand.
you ask
I
a
just
question
wanna-
of GAO and they come back to you.
What I
You
wanna-
know what? You don't have to use your staff. God bless the fact that we got GAO. They went off and did the work. They came back with the results. We were fairly busy too, if I remember. So
Yeah,
you know,
we're
this
all-
is just a question of whether
we're
or
all
not
real
this is
busy.
a priority. This happens to be a priority for
What
me.
I
and I hope
would-
for the committee, and I hope for the Department of Labor.
Now, may I respond?
Sure.
And I will respond, and I will not interrupt you when you respond to interrupt me.
Just having a conversation.
That's great. What I would like to say is, I am totally in agreement with you that this should be fixed.
I knew we'd get there. Excuse me, I'm sorry.
We get along well personally. I will try to maintain the decorum of not interrupting you again.
And I'm going to try really hard too.
That would be great, Mr. Chairman. Now, I think we're in agreement that there is a problem with this 19%. I think we're in agreement of how we should fix it. I'm not concerned about blaming you because you've just been chairman for 2 years and I was just chairman for a year. I think the important thing is they have not been able to tell us that this didn't happen under FDR, you know, or under Truman. The important thing is that it's 19% of people that need to be helped, and there's a way to address that. And I think that it's important that we do that, and it's incumbent upon us to do that. And I will work with you to make sure that that happens. I just want to make sure that we're not trying to play a game of political blame, that we're really trying to help the 19%. And I think that there's a way to do it. We're going to have to get the department in here and in a non-finger pointing way, go after those employees that are not doing their job. They're hired, they're paid, and then once we find out that all 1,000 of them are doing their job adequately, if they still can't get to the 19%, then they should hire more people. And they should be adequately trained, and they should understand the importance of their job is to uphold and carry out the law so that people are paid for an honest day's wages for an honest day's work. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. McKean. Mr. Kildee.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Coots, you said that the complaint input system is fundamentally flawed. Does it need restructuring or just adherence to the present rules and regulations?
I think it's a combination of improved customer service. You heard the audio here and the way that people were treated sometimes. I think it's a matter of tone and the way you treat people with respect. And it's also a matter of competence with making sure that all the cases are recorded in the system. I mentioned cases aren't recorded in the system. So, for example, if you have a repeat employer that's making all kinds of, having all kinds of issues, and you don't record cases in the system, how can you go back and make sure when a new complaint comes in that that employer hasn't done several other wage theft or other types of violations? And so it's a combination of customer service, competence, and enforcement at that front intake process. And to me, if you don't do a good job at the front of the process, you don't even get to the 19% necessarily, because some people will probably walk away and not even file a complaint.
Is there someone within the department or the agency within the department, not GAO, but that is in charge of quality control?
I think there are individuals in Washington that try to do studies and monitor that situation, but again, because complaints aren't recorded into the system at all, it's difficult to go back and check to see if a good job was done if there's no record of that call ever coming in.
I know very often if you call a company or an agency, sometimes you will hear your call may be recorded for quality control. That's commonly done in the private sector.
IRS does that too.
I've
listened to the call centers in IRS and other federal agencies, I believe, do that to monitor the quality of the responses people make. And sometimes the calls are not known. You're actually monitoring someone, they don't know you're monitoring them, or you're listening for QC purposes.
I always admit I have a kind of mixed feelings on that third-party listening, but at least they are concerned about the purpose is for quality control. And I don't see a real concern for quality control. Every investigator should be impartial. I mean, this person calling in, the person is, in a sense, a judge and a solver of this. But many of them seem to be on the side of the employer or have just worn out in the job and don't care. They come to work in the morning and they go home and don't feel like I've done some justice today. You know, if I were talking to one of them, I would say, you know, the laborer is worthy of his hire. And each one of those investigators, how often and how regularly, or are they at all, is there investigative prowess evaluated?
I'm not aware of any internal reviews, other internal
I think
reviews.
that each investigator has internal metrics based on the back wages that they collect, the time it takes them to enforce a case, but as far as success rates and how effective they are, that's not part of the metrics as far as we know.
So a person could get into a position where they could just show up.
Yes, I mean, I would caution the committee, too, to say just throwing money at this issue is not necessarily going to solve the problem. You could have more people, but if they're the wrong people without the right tools, you might end up with the same result. So you've got to look at this from a bigger perspective, that you need improved people, processes, and systems. And within people, are you hiring the right people? Are you training them correctly? Is there proper quality control over the work that they do, et cetera? So I would just caution, just throwing FTEs at this and, you know, repeating some of the same things that are being done now isn't necessarily going to get you a better result.
And I would add that I've interviewed multiple investigators in the field, and most, if not, I would say many of them, and pretty much most of them, are dedicated and concerned about this issue. So I think it does get more to your case of what you said, where they're worn out. There's a lot of cases they're having to respond to as rapidly as possible, and there's just a lot of work to be done.
Well, that's why technology is important, too. I mean, you can leverage your resources better if you have at your fingertips the ability to determine whether a company is bankrupt or not, where that company is located, what their revenues are. They don't have those tools right now from what we can see. And so if I were to do investigations for the Congress without those tools, I couldn't do the job. I couldn't be up here talking to this committee and the other committees we work for with the kinds of investigative findings we have. You've got to have good technology to be an effective enforcement and investigative unit.
You know, as far as quality control, we have much smaller operations. I have 18 people working for me, so it's much easier to evaluate. But every week at our staff meetings, I say, when someone calls us with a problem, we should not take that as a burden, but as an opportunity. And now, that might be self-serving for me, because every 2 years I have to give an accounting on my stewardship, right? But if I find people on my staff who look upon a call as a burden rather than an opportunity, I don't want them on my staff. And if we could transfer some of that over to the Department of Labor, that could be very
I think that's a great point. I mean, the culture of, is this a customer of you or someone who you're going to treat with, you know, we have a hotline. We get people to call in all the time, no matter if they're crazy. We get people to call, say, I'm a paranoid schizophrenic, you know, I've had some sort of experience, but we treat them all the same. We don't record them all as cases because some of them have issues that have nothing to do with GAO or anything that we're able to help them with, but we still treat them all the same no matter what. And I think that's an important piece of a culture here that needs to be addressed.
Thank you, Mr. Coots. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Some of the, I want to just comment that all of us believe that workers ought to be paid honest wage for an honest day's work. Some of the information that you presented, the one that was most disturbing was this meat packer in Modesto, California, accusing child labor laws being violated and young people, young children missing school and working on dangerous machines. That was fictitious, correct?
Correct.
So it wasn't true that that was happening.
No, but the
fact that the investigator didn't follow up on it, or DOL employee didn't follow up on it, is the point, right?
Yes.
We don't want people across this nation going away from this hearing thinking that children are working at a meat packing plant in Modesto, California, without anybody following up.
That's correct. It was one of our undercover agents.
I want to just correct the record. Charlie Norwood, who was a member of this committee and longstanding member of this committee and passed a couple of years ago, in fact, did a similar oversight with the use of GAO at the Department of Labor's offices, workers' compensation offices, programs, and the like. Similar issues of incompetency we raised at that time, and you would acknowledge that previous work has, in fact, been done, would you not?
Yes, and I'm not sure how far back that goes. The latest report of GAO, aside from the 2 investigative reports we did, was a GAO report issued at your hearing last year in July.
A couple of your comments that you made, you said that this is just the tip of the iceberg, that the complaint intake process, investigation process wasn't adequate. Do you have any reason to believe that that this type of activity by career civil service employees at the Department of Labor is any different than at any other department?
No, not necessarily. I mean,
So it could be the same at other departments?
Yes.
And this your investigation focused on career rank and file employees within the Department of Labor, correct?
It focused on the 32,000 complaints that were recorded by Wage and Hour for fiscal 2007, and it was primarily related to that, in addition to the undercover calls we made, which are real-time calls over the last several.
And the folks who respond to those complaints are career rank and file employees of the Department of Labor?
That's correct, yes.
Do you know if any of those folks are members of a union?
That wasn't part of our discussion.
You wouldn't, they may or may not be.
We're not aware of that.
Right.
We've heard some comments from some folks on the committee here that these employees were, quote, lying, seemed that they were, quote, worn out or didn't care. Do you know if these would be the same level of employees that would be charged with handling, for example, a national health care program?
Don't know.
No way to know that.
No.
So it's possible that folks who are advocating for something like a national health care program, that these would be the same level of employees that would be answering the phone for complaints in that area as well. Is that correct?
The level of employees answering the phone ranges from, I think, a GS-5 all the way up to GS-12 investigator.
Could be the same.
So
could be the same.
It's a regular.
So the prospect, it's curious, some of the calls or some of the recordings that you made or played for us, one of the employees gave the information to the individual calling that they had a private right of action. They could take their employer to court. That was accurate information, correct?
Yes, correct. They're oftentimes referred, when there's a backlog or we say can't get to your case, you can file a private lawsuit.
When I call the federal government, sometimes I get that too. You ought to go somewhere else. You ought to look to somebody else. You ought to try some other avenue. So it's wholly likely that folks who would be wanting to set up a nationalized pension plan, 401k plan run by the federal government, that the employees who would be responsible for investigating or answering challenges to a plan like that would be the same level of employee as these folks. Is that correct?
If they're between what Mr. Myers said, GS-5 and 12, it's possible. It's just something we don't have any direct knowledge of.
So the prospect for allowing the federal government to be more intrusive in other areas of our lives, health care and financial security for one's family, might be under the control of folks just like the people, the 19% that have, as some others have said, were just worn out. Is that accurate?
It's possible.
It's possible.
Sure, it's possible.
Yeah. Well, as a physician, member of Congress, it concerns me greatly that there are members of the House of Representatives who are clearly convinced that this is exactly where we need to go to have the federal government running our entire health care system, and consequently it is instructive to look to other areas that the government controls, I believe, for increasing education of both members of the House of Representatives, Congress, and the American people as to what that might look like. Thank you. I yield back.
Ms. McCarthy.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you again for holding this hearing. Mr. Klutz, if I remember correctly, July of 2008, we had a hearing almost on the same subject. Is that not true?
That's correct.
And at that hearing, didn't we have representation from the Department of Labor?
Yes.
And if I remember correctly, one of the statements that was put from the Assistant Secretary, Alexander, I'm going to pronounce his name wrong, Presenteno, touted his division's effectiveness by citing WHD's own performance statistics and rejected everything that you said. He also said the Department of Labor effectively enforcing our wage and hour laws, and he responded with an unqualified yes. And I guess I want to, with the videos that we saw or the voice messages that we saw, Those were random calls that you made, or were they to the same person all the time?
They were 6 offices, the ones I mentioned earlier, across the country.
Across the country?
Baltimore, Miami, Dallas, California, yes.
Correct. You've done an awful lot of these investigations. With that being said, with the investigation that you made and the telephone calls that your department made and the tapes that you heard, would you say this was probably a fairly large amount of people giving answers that were quite not true?
It's highly likely there's many others doing the same thing. You know, the one thing that we can do for committees like yours is give you an inside look at what a real person faces when they approach the government. Because if we had gone to their office and said, hey, we're GAO, we want to talk to you about how you handle phone calls, I don't expect we would have got any of those examples provided to us from the Department of Labor. So this gives you a real picture of what it looks like if you're a victim of wage theft or some other violation of FSLA.
And by the way, I do the same thing. I call my office to see how they answer the phone. That's
Good
just
process.
something, because they're representing me. But let's go on. On the, as we go forward with this, and I'm sure we're going to have another hearing on this, what do you think needs to be done to ensure all complaints are at least documented at the Department of Labor?
Well, we believe they should be documented. I mean, if something is, they get a lot of calls probably that aren't real cases. Someone like our hotline, they might call about something that has nothing to do with a labor law violation. Those shouldn't be given case numbers. But everything that comes into the system, like our 10 calls, should be given a case number. And even if they're not going to work it, they should keep it in the system. Because what if that employer comes back again and has committed another wage law violation? Then you develop a trend of information. If you don't report the information in the system, you can't do linking of cases. So with our hotline, our fraud net we call it, we give case numbers to everything. We go back and I can determine whether there were other wage and hour division things or Medicaid, Medicare, whatever the case. Maybe we can go back and research by person, company, theme, et cetera, to determine what's happened in the past. And is the first thing we do about a complaint coming in, have they been here before?
Just to follow up on that, my office, my district office and my Washington office, anyone that calls for help, we open up a case file for them, and it goes into our computer so that we can have a running issue on what we are doing, what they're doing, and how it ends up in the case before it's closed. So I think that we're all trained that way to basically make sure that we're tracking our constituents, and each member has over 600,000 people that we represent. What do you think, as we go forward, does the labor need to do to assist the situation and make sure that enough proper trained people are in place to adequately investigate allegations of wage theft?
Well, they need to take a top-to-bottom look at this. It's not necessarily do they need more people, which they maybe do need more people, but it's better trained people possibly. Are they hiring? What are the criteria of the people they're hiring? That's something we didn't look at as part of this, but that's a valid question. I mean, do you have the right kinds of people? Because if you have investigators that are willing to take a no answer and just say, okay, we're done, I have investigators that work for me. Not a one of them would accept that as an answer. I mean, they would at least follow up with a second question or you do something besides just say, okay, thank you, and then they call the victim, the potential victim here, and say, we're sorry, we can't help you. They said no. I mean, that's not really an investigation. I'm not sure what you call that. It's just a thing. It's a phone call we made. And so you heard our frustrated victim on the undercover call saying, is that all you do? Just make a phone call. And I think a lot of times with the smaller cases, that is all that they do.
Last question. One of the other things that we do in our office, and I'm going to ask if you think it's worthwhile to look into that for the Department of Labor also, we retrain, even if someone that's been with me for 13 years, every couple of years we go through a whole retraining program because new techniques are always coming up, new ways of handling things are always coming up. I was just wondering if that would be something that would be important to do for the Department of Labor.
Yes, do they do something like that?
Yeah, there are annual updates that investigators go through. I think a focus, though, needs to be shifted in some cases from compliance assistance and, you know, trying to go out there and walk the thin, the middle line between the complainant and the employer to enforcement of law. It's an emphasis on enforcing the laws on the books needs to be re-emphasized with investigators every year to make sure they feel that their job is important and to get it done.
I yield back the balance of my time. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Rowe.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just a couple of questions. Could you sort of put this in context about how many cases, you may have said this before I came into the room, but I was at another committee hearing, but how many do they handle a person? Like you said, if you just answer the phone and say no, that's hardly a case, but just I know from my experience and what I've done in a lifetime, I know how much I can do in a day's work. How many cases are these people just overwhelmed with number of cases, or what?
There's 32,000 cases that were recorded in the system for 2007. As I mentioned, a lot of cases don't get recorded in the system, so we know it's more. We don't know how many more. And they had 700 to 800 investigators for 2007, and I think they have still roughly about that amount. So that gives you an idea of the different volumes you're talking about. And cases are very different. A case can be one person, or it can be thousands of people. So there's a wide range of what a case is. So not all cases are equal. Some cases could take thousands of hours to investigate. Some could take a couple of hours.
Well, and to follow up on that, I guess, and to follow up on some of the other the questions that we asked was that, is there any way to measure what kind of job they're doing? I mean, are there any kind of standards that they're doing, any oversight that they're doing? I know some of your testimony said they weren't being very effective, but is there a way to measure that? We have that in most of our offices. We have standards, job evaluations, and so forth.
We measured these cases just based on the allegation that was filed and whether an adequate job was done of responding to that allegation and investigating it. In last year's testimony, the other witness from GAO provided statements that the Wage and Hours continually shifted their goals and shifted their metrics they used to measure compliance, so there wasn't a consistent way to evaluate them over the years. But for our investigation, it was purely based on the case we were looking at and whether it was adequately responded to.
But some information they have that's useful, I think. They say they collected about $220 million in 2007. Now, again, we know based on our work they probably collected less than that because a lot of stuff in the system doesn't ever get collected. But let's say they collected about $200 million. That's useful to know. Their budget's about $200 million. Is that a good ratio? I don't know. They helped 341,000 employees. Again, we probably think it's less than that because we know some people that say they weren't helped. But there's also tens of thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands they didn't help. So there's some useful information like that. And the thing we don't know, again, getting back to asking you, if they're asking you for more resources, what evidence do they have to show you what they'll do with those resources and what the return on investment that would be? See, if I was there, I would say, well, I want to show, if you give me an extra $1, how much more can I collect for wage theft or other types of cases I can work to help victims here?
I agree. Thanks very much, Mr. Chairman. I yield back my time.
Thank you. Mr. Courtney.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for holding this hearing, which is a completely logical follow-on to last July's hearing, where this issue was first identified and GAO testified, of course, at that hearing. I also, for the record, for the benefit of people who are watching this hearing, I think it's important to know that Secretary Solis submitted a statement indicating that the department is now hiring an additional 250 wage and hour division caseworkers, which was the result of the 2009 spending bill, which some of us in this room supported and others did not. But clearly there is now, with the new administration, movement towards strengthening the workforce there. And additionally, there's another 100 workers that are being brought on as a result of the stimulus bill, the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act, which the President again signed into law just recently. So there is good news, at least in terms of the strengthening the caseworkers, which has been identified by some here today as potentially the problem. The other one issue which we had discussed last July, a pattern that emerged from your investigation was that the prior, the wage and hour division caseworkers who were interacting with complainants were being told, well, go get a lawyer, as sort of the way to close out the file. And again, I just want to ask you a simple question. I mean, in fact, the mission of the Department of Labor is to provide free advocacy for workers who've been denied their wages, and in fact, not to force or direct them to private representation through lawyers. Isn't that correct?
That's an important point, yes. And that gets back to the issue of resources. And is the mission to serve only those we have the resources to, or is it to serve all the people that come in? Is the mission to serve greater than 10 numbers of people, or greater than 7? That's an important issue because it appears the reality is they're picking and choosing who they're able to serve.
And there clearly was an irony in last July, which was pointed out, because the morning of the hearing in the New York Times, the administration actually put out a statement saying that their goal was to stop trial lawyers from enriching themselves from this, and in fact the opposite was occurring, which is that people were being steered towards private counsel as a way of getting a remedy. And again, I think certainly this committee wants to go the direction of the original mission of the Department of Labor, which is to, again, as an administrative agency, provide people with help without having to incur the expense and difficulty of retaining private counsel.
Well, the reality is, if you're one person making $6 or $7 an hour, how many attorney's fees hours can you afford?
And I guess the other question is that there's also a time issue. Now, again, I think throughout some of the notes, you talked about the fact that, I mean, there's a statute of limitations for bringing a claim. Is that correct?
Correct. 2 years from the time of the violation, yes.
So if you filed a complaint, you're waiting, and then the case is closed out by saying, go get a lawyer. I mean, the fact is that that scenario makes it even worse.
Right. Sometimes the clock runs out, and employers know that, and some of the egregious ones stalled, and eventually the case went away with no collections.
And lastly, just looking at the locations of where some of these cases took place. I mean, I'm seeing, from the West Coast to the East Coast and in between. I mean, the fact is that this seems to be a much more widespread problem than one field office. From again, just the report that you've submitted here, and is that a safe conclusion to make?
I think we've done enough work to say that yes, this is a national issue. We can't say every single office has the same problems, but there's many, many offices that have these types of problems, yes.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Mr. Saban.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for your leadership on this very important issue. Thank you, Mr. Cox, and Mr. Meyer. I'm trying to learn something here. In your undercover testing, how did you arrive at the types of jobs to use to determine this? Is there and I'm trying to,
yes,
was there a certain, scientific testing or a process you did? I'm trying to determine if these are, if the lack of attention given to these cases are because there are to a certain type of jobs or those making so much money per hour, or if they're minimum wage earners, or where is the lack of attention? Is it just endemic throughout the system for?
The undercover calls we made were what we thought were common complaints we'd seen in the database, and the one was the child labor one. I'll just give you some examples. Dry cleaners, convenience store, dishwasher, janitor, painter, lawnmower service. Those are pretty typical of what we've seen in the database of legitimate complaints coming in. So we tried to recreate what would be a legitimate complaint in legitimate scenarios out there.
And this was done throughout the nation?
Yes, again, 6 offices: Baltimore, Birmingham, Dallas, Miami, San Jose, and West Covina, California. Those were the 6 offices we made those 10 calls to.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. What do we have? Ms. Titus, Congressman Titus.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Gentlemen, you were asked if you had any evidence that the employees of the division had deliberately been told to mishandle cases. And of course, the answer is no. But I've often found that lack of resources and capricious enforcement are generally the result and reflection of administrative priorities. So let me ask you that same question just a little bit differently. Do you have any evidence that the professionals in the department who should know what's needed to be effective requested the resources or the tools that you say that they need? I mean, those tools seem to me to be pretty obvious. You're talking about training in customer service, recording of cases, access to information on bankruptcy. Is there any evidence that they were trying to do the best job that they could to serve these workers, to help them get their wages?
I think speaking specifically to the information technology, when we raised the issue initially in our first audit and then in this follow-up audit, it seemed to be a new idea to the management in Washington at the headquarters level for wage and hour, that it wasn't something they had explored in the past. So I don't know if they considered it before this point.
And that's just shameful, it seems to me, a real derelict of duty, I think, because I believe it should be critical to use all the tools possible to help people get their wages, and that's why I'm so pleased to have your report and that the chairman is making this a priority. Just one other kind of more technical question, too. You mentioned that in states where you have strong enforcement of labor laws, you have a better result at the national level. I know in Nevada we've had some serious problems. Are there any things that we can do legislatively or as we look at the operations of this division and that relationship with states to improve the situation so that even if you have a weak link at the state level, we can make it work better?
I think when Wage and Hour reassesses their staffing and the allocation of resources, it should be important for them to consider states with, let's say, minimum wages that are higher than the federal minimum wage. That makes a big difference on if the federal government should take a case or if the state should take a case. So that needs to be an important part of their consideration, because more resources are likely going to be needed in states where there's no state agency that can assist complainants.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm not here today to finger point and look backwards too much, but I think it really is important to point out to people that are watching this. The former Secretary of Labor, I saw her 2 times. I'm in my 2nd term. Once was in the back of a car with her husband at a parade running for re-election, Mitch McConnell, and the other was when President Obama was sworn in. I've not seen her at this committee. But she sent the acting administrator, Alexander Pasatino, I believe, who just basically said that you guys didn't know what you were talking about. Also, which by the way, I couldn't disagree with him more. I think you clearly do. Also, you have a Department of Labor that significantly cut funding for the wage and hour divisions. And I'm not suggesting that we throw people into a position and that you're going to solve this entire thing by having more people. But I do know that when you cut the funding for the wage and hour division, problems are going to occur. And you know, I just find this, especially when you're talking about people's salary, an honest day, as was mentioned, you know, an honest day pay for an honest day's work. I find it almost unbelievable that people would do that and would treat people like that. And then just lastly, before I have a question, you know, we are going to have comprehensive national health care, and for the people watching this hearing today, I can assure you that for those 47 million Americans that don't have it, I don't think they're going to have to worry about who's answering the phone. I think they're going to have something at least that they can go to the hospital and get taken care of. My question to you, your investigation revealed an ineffective wage and hour division that discouraged wage theft complaints, but in the situation when complaints were recorded and assigned as a case to an investigator, they were often adequately investigated. To me, this indicates that many of the problems at the wage and hour could be fixed by the dedication of more resources and a labor secretary with the will to address wage theft complaints. What are your thoughts on community partnerships? In other words, with partnering up so that more people can be served and in a timely fashion and with respect. And by the way, I just want to say I apologize for getting here late. I didn't hear the complaints, but after listening to you testify, I can imagine just how egregious they were for people, whether they were fictitious or not. The fact of the matter is, the person on the other end of the line didn't know that. So I'm wondering what you think about on community partnerships, knowing the shortage of the staff and some other things, and maybe working with some nonprofits.
I think that makes sense as part of an overall strategy for how they're going to address it along with the states. As Mr. Meyer mentioned, we have effective enforcement of states. It frees up the federal offices across the country to maybe take on bigger cases and not worry as much about the smaller cases. So partnership and leveraging resources, and I agree with you that just throwing money at this isn't necessarily the answer. Part of the money needs to go to technology. Part of this needs to be better processes, maybe even a better phone system for handling the complaints that is much more customer friendly. So it's a bigger picture thing than just putting more people on this, but community partnerships and working with states and others, it makes perfect sense to me.
Do you think that the problems that the wage and hour are causing wage theft victims to not file complaints? In other words, when they hear that people are being treated like this, or they get treated like people just aren't, said it's not going to do me any good to make the phone call, so I'm not even going to.
Yeah, I mean, actually those 10 cases, we made 115 calls, and 76 times it went directly to voicemail, and frequently we never got a call back. We had to call month after month to try to get them to call us back. So I think some people would give up eventually. So I really believe that what you said is true, that some people are not filing complaints because of that, and I mentioned that in my opening statement also.
And that would be, I mean, that's really a tragedy. They're not filing a complaint because they just think it isn't going to matter.
Right, and they don't have, they're making, like I said, $6, $7, $8, $9, $10 an hour, and getting an attorney is going to be a challenge.
Let me just ask you this. I'm almost out of time here. What are the one or two things that we can do, that this committee, this Congress can do, to make sure that ordinary people, when they call in, have at least a fighting chance to be able to get the wages that they feel that they've been denied and that they have coming, so that they have, you know, as I said, for ordinary people, bureaucracy is tough enough as it is. So what can we do as a committee and a Congress, do you think, to help these people out? Because the bottom line is, we can finger point all we want to, but it's helping the ordinary people out.
I think one of the things legislatively we saw was that the 2-year statute of limitations, sometimes when cases are ongoing, end up running out because either they start late on the investigations at labor or the employer stalls. Looking at specific targeted ways to possibly look at legislation in that area, we're going to probably put in our recommendation in a matter for the Congress to consider. We don't make policy, but we offer to you to consider policy. I think that's a situation where you could consider policy. The other thing I would say is, again, not walking away from this, and as Chairman Miller said, consistent oversight of this until you're satisfied that the systems, processes, and controls in place are good. And we could even go back for the committee at some point in time and do similar tests to what we did this time and see if they do better.
Thank you very much. You're back, Mr. Chairman.
Councilman Woolsey.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Last session of my subcommittee, the Subcommittee on Workforce Protections, held a hearing on the lack of enforcement by the Wage and Hour Division of child labor laws. There was evidence to the contrary, but the former acting administrator, Passantino, testified at the hearing that child labor complaints were the division's top priority. And he said that more than once. So in that regard, what did your investigation find, and what recommendations do you have for improvements in that area of child labor, and including farm worker children?
With respect to child labor, you know, one of our undercover calls was a child labor call because we knew that was a priority of the Labor Department, and their policy, I believe, or practice at least, is that even if it's an anonymous tip, that they're supposed to open a case and look into it. So we planted an undercover call with them that kids were working during school hours operating circular saws, meat grinders at this meat plant, and when we went back to look in the system, it wasn't anywhere. It wasn't recorded in the system. They hadn't done anything with it, and so they were concerned about that too, because they agree with your statement that that's a top priority, but the reality was in that case they didn't do anything. We had seen a case like that last year too. That was a child labor law complaint. So we don't have a lot of experience because not a lot of the actual recorded items in the system are child labor complaints, but in several cases now we've seen that maybe it's not such a priority if they're not actually following up.
And if there is a scattering of instances like this, you have to know there's many, many more, right? I mean,
certainly, I expect there are several other. Yeah. I mean, you have to believe that.
Well then, what is the deal? I mean, it comes from the top. So now with a new administration and a new Secretary of Labor, and then there will be new deputies and new heads of departments, and with a new attitude, is that going to be enough to change this, or is it really that the short-staffed, undertrained, lack of motivation, lack of tools? I mean, you can't make somebody do the job they're supposed to do if they don't have the tools to do them.
I don't think you can point at one thing. I think if you just focus on throwing staff at it, it's not going to solve the problem. That's one element possibly here. But as you mentioned, culture is one thing. The right people, enough of them, are they properly trained? You have good processes in place. And an example of that is, you know, if you accept the neighbor saying, well, the company is bankrupt, and then you walk back to the office, you close the case, you say, yep, they're bankrupt. Well, we had cases like that. And then we went back and looked in the system, and the company's not bankrupt. They just moved, or they actually didn't have the trucks there that day, or something like that. I mean, that's a matter of just bad processes. You should have a process that you're going to validate. If you're going to say in the system that someone's bankrupt, you should validate that with independent evidence that that, in fact, is true before you drop the case.
So are there training programs that you in your survey, were there employee training programs that would help the employee know how to research whether a person was bankrupt or not, or do we just assume that person is supposed to know these things?
Based on the investigators and technicians we talked to, their training in that area relates to looking it up on public searches if a local court keeps their records online, or if there's some Google search results that'll find a business. It doesn't get to the level of sophistication that we have with public court records, federal court records, LexisNexis, some real robust technology. And I would also say for child labor complaints, one way to make sure that they're dealt with is to force people to record the complaint when it comes in, because then there is at least a record that it's there. And I think it'd be very hard for management at the Department of Labor to ignore those cases. And I think they really genuinely are concerned about them, but if it never makes it into the system and it's not on their database, no one knows about it.
How about farm labor kids? Was there anything in your surveys that your report about them?
Our statistical sampling didn't randomly pull up any farm labor, Migrant Seasonal Worker Protection Act cases. However, through interviews in the field, we did see that a number of offices at the Department of Labor take time out of their year to specifically investigate MISPA cases. So it's an emphasis at Department of Labor how effective it is. Unfortunately, it just wasn't pulled up in the random sample, so it wasn't a large enough percentage for us to look at.
Well, Mr. Chairman, I would believe with Hilda Solis as the new Secretary of Labor that farm kids are going to have a lot more emphasis than they have in the past, and children in general. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you. It's the intent of the chair that this committee hearing will end at noon, but we will have a second round if members want to participate. One of the things that concerns me in this construct is the person who may be most financially vulnerable to lost wages in terms of major disruptions in their life. They could lose a car payment, they could lose a house payment, they could lose their rent, they could be evicted. They're the person that really has the least, has no margins for error. So you lose $800 in a paycheck, whether that's, again, over a week or 2 weeks, whatever period of time that paycheck has come in for, you lose that $800, you don't have margins. Turning to an attorney isn't really an option for an $800 case. And yet those are the cases that are quickly reconciled, either yes, no, maybe, thank you very much. So they get the least resources focused on them, and yet they're the most vulnerable. There's something wrong in that system. I understand why you do it, because if somebody's withholding is failed to pay a couple of $1 million or hundreds of thousands of dollars, that seems more important unless you happen to be that person that lost the $800 paycheck. So it seems to me you have an obligation to do a very thorough investigation, maybe not terribly time-consuming, but a very thorough investigation at the outset for that individual. Does that make any sense? I mean, the system seems to be tilted a little bit away from the average worker in the occupations that you cited.
Yeah, the system is tilted away, and it gets back to what's the mission. Is the department willing to spend $3,000 to collect $800 for an employee? And that isn't just, you can't just look at it as a cost basis, too. You look at future compliance and things like that. So just working to make sure that these employers know that they will go after some of those smaller cases can also help future compliance. But the reality now is they're kind of picking and choosing, it appears, because of issues with resources and technology and whatever the case may be.
I'd also add that for conciliation specifically right now, Wage and Hours policy is to make one or several phone calls, and if it doesn't result in collections, they drop the case at that point. And most of the time, those are actually effective. The ones that we looked in the database, most of the time a normal employer will comply once they've been told they've broken the law in some area. But the ones that don't should be raised to the level of a full investigation and followed up on. So you can have a rapid response and a more thorough response in those limited cases.
And Mr. Myers, I assume you're saying that, given your that maybe some of these people aren't the best trained in how to be the most effective on the phone, or what resources they should bring in advance to that phone call. Maybe a little bit of work before the phone call and you speak with more authority, possibly.
True. There's very little work done before that first phone call.
Well, not only that, I mean, you did hear some of those where
Yes.
they simply said, are you willing to pay? The answer was no. Okay. I mean,
So
it's
the employer steals $800 out of my paycheck, whether it's overtime or regular pay, and the likelihood maybe is that nothing will happen. That employee steals $800 out of petty cash in that company, and that employee is going to jail. In all likelihood, that employee is going to jail. So you steal it out of their paycheck, you go past jail, you're free. You steal it out of petty cash, you're going to go to jail. I mean, somehow there has to be an initial investigation that understands what took place here. This isn't, in many of these, this isn't a bookkeeping error. This is a conscious decision not to obey the law. Mr. Myers, you talked about they have to understand they're there to enforce the law, the minimum wage law, the overtime laws, the hours worked, all of those things. So a conscious decision in many of these instances is simply made not to pay these individuals. A conscious decision to rob that business, and you have two different outcomes.
right. If you have a situation now where employers know probably the worst case scenario, they may get investigated, and if so, they might have to pay what they owed in the first place. I mean, so you have that kind of a system out
There's no
there.
penalty.
There's no penalty.
You steal from the employee, there's no penalty. You
You're
steal
not
from
going to
the
get
employee,
criminal,
you go
for
to
sure.
jail.
There's no criminal. And so worst case, you pay what you owe, and sometimes you compromise it down to something less than you owe. So it is a system with minimal teeth to it at this point.
And there's 30,000 complaints in this system in 2007?
Correct.
We heard when you were here in July from Wage and Hours that they suggested that they resolved 93% of their cases where employers agreed to pay. Does that mean they got 93% of the wages that were wrongfully taken returned?
No.
What does
No,
that mean?
Well, that's what's recorded in the system. And as I mentioned for our undercover calls, in several cases, the employer initially agreed to pay, and several weeks later, our fictitious employee called back and said, by the way, investigator, they never paid me. We went back into the system several months later, and all those cases showed that the case was actually paid. So their recording is paid if the employer says I paid, but they don't go back to follow up, or even if someone calls and says they never were paid, they don't go back and change the records. Another important thing is...
So not only now is the employer stealing from his employees, he's now lying to the government.
Correct.
To the enforcement agency.
And we're recording it as a successful case, even though he didn't pay.
Right.
Yeah, I'd say we have a cultural problem here, if that's success.
The
I don't
other
think
thing I
that's
want to mention
success
on
for
that,
anybody
too,
on this committee.
There's another case we saw, too, that's very interesting. The actual amount owed was $150,000, but the amount assessed ultimately was $78,000, so it was compromised. What they recorded in the system was assessed $78,000, paid $78,000. So in that case, it appeared that 100% was paid. The reality is 50% was paid because they owed $150,000. So you always have to get behind these numbers like 93% and say, is there something more to the story than 93%? So you have several factors. I'm not saying they're not collecting hundreds of millions. They probably are. But that number is probably overstated based on a number of cases we've seen.
You know, you touched upon also the issue that about money and workload and the rest of that. It's kind of interesting that as I look at a chart here, I think this is from CBO, the money went down 4%, a little 4.2% from 2001 to 2008, but the full-time employees went down 21%, 23%. So I mean, it wasn't apparently, it wasn't money. They just decided they were going to. I don't know if these people went somewhere else or whether they were discharged or what have you. But the numbers in the department in the wage and hour division, the employees went down continuously over this time, 21%. But the money to the appropriated dollars didn't go down.
Right. The number of investigators has gone down from 1997 to 2007 by 20 to 25% in that range.
Right.
Correct.
Let me ask you, one of my colleagues raised the issue of the statute of limitations. This clearly works absolutely against, from at least my conclusion is from looking at these cases, if the department's not efficient, they're working on my time, if I have a statute of limitations run against me and my ability to recover. Have you thought about what the alternative would be for starting the statute? Or?
Well, we believe that we're going to put a proposal into our report that has recommendations for a matter for Congress, and to consider whether or not the statute should be extended. I'm not sure what the right wording is necessarily, how you'd write the bill. In certain cases where there's a legitimate claim, Wage and Hour is investigating it, that the clock stops ticking, and that would be something that would help not only the Wage and Hour Division, but the victims who we see oftentimes get nothing.
So you would toll that during the investigation?
Yeah, I think that's the right term. Yes.
Yeah, okay. And so then if they did a good job, maybe I get my money back. If they didn't, or they refused to, or whatever the case was, I still have my right. If they used up 6 months of the time, I still have my full 2 years to proceed against the employer and have time to do that.
Or at least more time, because let's say it takes you a year to get to the first point, you'd at least have an extra year. Depends on how you write the bill or how you would write that legislation. But yeah, you'd have time to see if Wage and Hour could resolve it, and if they can't, you'd still have at least a period to file your own lawsuit.
When you look at other agencies, are there agencies that have better models in terms of measuring outcomes and user-friendly, customer-friendly systems in intake and initial investigations that the Department of Labor should be looking at?
Well, I thought the interesting idea, and I don't remember which member it was that mentioned the monitoring of the calls to determine whether how people are handling the actual people. That's an interesting idea. I've seen, I said at IRS, I've observed how they do it, and I think in that case they know that they're doing it, or at least randomly doing it. But it keeps people on their toes, and it makes people know that we're measuring this as one of the considerations in your job rating and the pay for performance you're going to get, or whatever raises you might get. So that was an interesting idea, I thought, that could be used on the complaint intake process.
That would also let you know whether or not that case was entered into the system, so that you would have follow-up, or you'd have data about that employer or that industry, or the rest of it. Would help you develop reliable data if that phone call was matched to a decision.
Yes, and I think you have to hold the Department of Labor accountable to make sure that all legitimate cases are entered into the system, because otherwise Congress doesn't have a very good idea of what kind of work's not getting done. It'd be nice for you to know that there were 6,000 cases, or whatever the number is, that they just didn't have time to get to. That would be an important metric.
You've mentioned the IRS. Do you know of other agencies that have done that, or?
With respect to metrics or other processes?
Monitoring calls, or?
I'd have to think about that. We could certainly think about that and get back to you on that.
Thank you. Mr. Rowe.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Obviously, when you see an investigation like this, it's embarrassing. When you see a performance that's this poor. My bet is there are a lot of people that are doing good work, too. And I suspect that there are a lot of good people who go to work every day and try to do their job correctly. And it would look to me like, and I've been in the private world my entire career, except for the last 90 days, and it would look to me like that it would be easy to ferret out, or with proper supervision, who these essentially bad actors are that are not doing their job well. And you know, this is just not acceptable to have a citizen of the United States call into one of our departments and be essentially just blown off. And I mean, it doesn't look to me like a terribly difficult problem to fix. And like you said, whether it's throwing more money at it may not be. It just may be having some requirements, some oversight. And I think having these random calls that are fictitious come in is a good idea. That's a way to find out if, and it may be just a few people that you're, I don't know whether you got to the same investigator each time or not, but that would be a pretty easy thing, I think, to hone in on about.
Well, what you're getting to, too, is the possibility of agencies testing themselves. You know, we've tested, for example, airport security by the TSA, trying to get improvised explosive devices through the checkpoints onto aircraft. They test themselves also. I mean, this is a case where you could have a unit set up in quality control that makes various calls just to see how they're handled. I think some of the members here have said even they call their own telephone system to see how their employees are handling potential constituents.
You know, I think it would be, obviously, we all know the story of the one mailman who's dumping the mail in the garbage truck so he doesn't have to deliver the mail. It may not be a deep problem, but it is a problem, and it needs to be solved. And I think there needs to be a mechanism to do that and report back to this committee. I yield back my time, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Mr. Kildee?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, gentlemen, for all you've done. I'm the one who mentioned the monitoring of calls, and that's, I asked this question in conjunction with that, but other things. what needs to be done to ensure that all complaints are at least documented at Wage and Hour Division, both technological things and personnel things? What can be assure us that they're at least documented?
Well, sorry, I didn't give you credit for that. I had lost track of who actually made the comment, but it was a good idea nonetheless. I would say that they need to make sure that they have written policies and training that it is a requirement that when a legitimate case comes in the door, not a case that has nothing to do with any violations of law, cases that are within their jurisdiction, things that whether they investigate or not, they need to know about, the policy should be to record it in the system. Policy guidance was sent out in the Southeast region that conciliations or the smaller cases are not to be recorded in the system if they are failed. That needs to be changed. Those cases need to go in the system so there is a record that even if you didn't investigate it, that employer committed a potential labor law violation. So if they do another one, you can go back and research in the system and say, hey, they've been here before, maybe this should become a bigger case now because we've had 3 or 4 complaints come in. So it needs to be a requirement, a policy, and it needs to be training.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much. Since I missed all of the testimony, I'll pass this time. Very rare for me, but I will do that at this time. All right, thank you. Next time I'll have twice as much time. All right, thank you. Thank you very much.
Mr. Hinojosa.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for having this hearing. I apologize that I was not able to be here at the beginning of this session, but I have a great deal of interest in the subject that was being discussed here today. I'd like to ask you about conciliation. What is the percentage of conciliations you estimate are never reported?
There's no way to know, but in the Southeast region, as I mentioned, which gets 57% of the recorded conciliations, the policy has been if it's not successful, you don't record it in the system. So it certainly is hundreds, potentially thousands. Since they're not recorded, there's no way to know.
What remedies would you suggest to improve the timeliness of processing complaints?
Processing of conciliations?
No.
Or of
just complaints that are brought to you. What do you suggest so that it will be more timely, that there's a response?
Well, that's a big issue, and many of the regions around the country have known backlogs that are 8 months, 10 months, 12 months, whatever the case may be. Those are region-specific issues in some cases they're national issues. So I think on a region-by-region basis, they have to assess whether they have sufficient staffing on board, and they have standards for how quickly they intend to get to cases and investigate cases. They need to make sure they have sufficient staffing, technology, and training so that they can meet those. And right now, many regions, and Mr. Mike could probably add comments on some of the regions that had the most significant problems, many regions don't meet those standards.
Right, I would say looking at the different offices we interviewed with, some have adequate resources and are responding. You know, a caseload for an investigator might be 3 or 4 cases, whereas in a different part of the country, someone has 8 to 10 cases on their desk, and when they get the case, it's already been 6, 8, sometimes 12 months since the complaint was originally filed. So there needs to be a review of where the resources are, Department of Labor, where they need to be shifted to, and then after that review has been done, decide if there's more resources that need to be allocated.
I know that you all have worked very hard, and based on the calls you made, what are some of the key areas that need to be addressed in your view to better serve low-wage workers, hourly workers, who are calling with allegations of wage theft?
Well, I mean, first of all, calls need to be returned, and a lot of calls were not returned. We went to voicemail, and they didn't call us back. So at a minimum, you should at least call people back. We mentioned recording cases in the system, following up to make sure that if an employer agreed to pay, that they actually pay. And if the employer reneged on an agreement to pay, you go back into the system and you correct the system to say that employer refused to pay and they did not pay. It's a matter of customer service and the quality of the investigations that are done. But I think that one of the big things you need to consider is making sure that people are handled with dignity, respect, and timely responses with respect to their allegations. And if they can't get to their allegations for several months, they have to be told that up front. And in some cases they are, and as Mr. Meyer mentioned, some offices, they're very prompt getting to people because they appear to have enough staff in place. Other ones are so overwhelmed, I think those are the ones that they're not even calling back people in some cases.
Knowing that it takes maybe months to address all the complaints, what types of problems did you identify that could be causing victims to get discouraged and not want to call again or notify WHD of their complaint?
Well, if someone tells you that if you file a complaint, your employer might fire you, that would discourage me from probably filing a complaint. So, you know, just some of the phone calls we played, or people lying. I mean, you know, that was just one case, but it was discouraging that someone would actually lie to us and say they checked IRS and they found that our fake company was below $500,000 in revenue. So be truthful with people, be straight with them, and handle them with dignity and respect is the way we would suggest that they handle it.
And being that my time is almost running out, give us a recommendation for improvement. What do you believe the mission should be of WHD?
I think it should be a combination of enforcing or encouraging voluntary compliance. The vast majority of companies in this country are going to want to do the right thing, and you handle them differently than the minority, which is going to either want to violate the law or be on the fence, and especially in tough times like this, maybe say, hey, I can stay in business 2 more months if I stiff a few employees, kind of a thing. And so you got to handle the enforcement side aggressively, which I think helps enforce or actually encourage future compliance. But the vast majority of companies that are trying to comply, as Mr. Meyer said, if you call them up, tell them that they violated the law, they owe money, they actually pay.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just trying to wrap my mind around what the chairman said about if somebody steals $800 from the company, they're going to jail. Somebody steals it from the employee, you know, you're lucky if anybody does anything about it. This question may have been asked and answered, and I apologize if it has, but I'm trying to get from your perspective. For the people who do the kinds of things that they're not supposed to do, they hang up or they don't return, you know, what's the recommendation to be able to weed these employees out so that they don't continue to do what they've been doing, which is either not talking to these people, hanging up on them, giving them false information, et cetera. So from your perspective, what does Wage and Hour need to do to identify these people, and then to get people in there that are actually going to be able to get the job done so that ordinary people can get that $800?
Well, the 10 we did that were played at the beginning of the hearing, management has asked for the names of those people and the information we have, and we will share that with them. The individual that lied, we have referred to the Office of Inspector General. With respect to the other things we've talked about here, such as Mr. Kildee talked about the potential monitoring of this, et cetera, those are ideas where you could do enhanced quality control procedures to weed out the employees that don't perform, that don't treat people well on the phone, who don't make phone calls back, or who do poor investigations. So having a better quality control system in place, performance management system, and then again, hiring and training people. What kind of people? We didn't look at that, but what kind of people are they hiring? What kind of training are they giving them? What backgrounds are they? You know, when we hire law enforcement people, for example, as our criminal investigators with executive branch experience. Those are people that have actually worked out there in the law enforcement field. They've served warrants, they've arrested, they've done undercover work before. So we bring in people with very specific qualifications, or our auditors and analysts, we look for very specific qualifications. I don't know exactly what their hiring is, but it's important to target the right people.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your testimony and this morning, and for your investigation. And if you'll thank your coworkers who participated in this, I'd appreciate that. And thank you for all of the work that your office does on behalf of the taxpayers in this country and the committees of Congress. We appreciate it. And we'd like to be able to continue to use you as an intellectual resource here as we think about what changes make sense and go forward on this problem. Thank you. With that, the committee stands adjourned. Take 21 days, 14 days to first submit statements. With that, all the usual unanimous consent requests are granted to the minority for today.